powerful. And I think that one thing that struck me as I was listening to your story is that I think a lot of times, unfortunately, growing up in the United States primarily, but I'm sure it applies to other places as well, you kind of tend to learn, whether it's overtly or sort of in a more subtle way, that your Blackness is a liability, right? Like the messages that we get about beauty, about worth, about opportunity in like I said, very subtle and not so subtle ways. Like we just grow up learning that your Blackness is not something to be celebrated. So the fact that you sort of had that from a young age and that you were able to turn that into an asset, really, like your identity and also your skill set, the combination of those making that an asset, I think is a really powerful story. So for anybody out there who's thinking like, oh, I haven't seen anybody that looks like me doing this work. Well, now you know Jamila is somebody that is doing that, and she's really trailblazing that sort of idea that yes, you can be all of who you are and do what you love. So I think that's really awesome, and I hope it inspires some people. So you talked a little bit about growing up and your parents having this more Pan-African sort of worldview. But where did you grow up originally? You mentioned your father being from Brooklyn. Is that where you grew up?
No, I grew up in Hartford, Connecticut, the Hartford area. I was actually born in New Haven. My family's really from New Haven, Connecticut. My mother's side, I should say. My mother was born and raised in New Haven, Connecticut. My father was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. And I was raised in the Hartford area. And for folks who are not familiar with Connecticut, there are Black people in Connecticut. New Haven is a Black neighborhood. It's not just Yale. It's a very Black neighborhood, as is Hartford. But, I was in the suburbs. I was in the city. I was mixed, but Hartford is my home. We call it the heartbeat.
And what was the first foreign language? Well, first, what languages do you speak? And then what was the first language that you learned? Sort of like what sparked your interest in initially getting started with language learning?
My professional languages are English and Spanish, as well as AAVE. And j'aime aussi le français. Eu estou estudando português também. I'm working on Portuguese, which is interesting because estudando português, when you, like, I really falo más portuñol. Like, I speak...
Yo también. Yo también.
I'm like, when I speak Portuguese, and it's funny because I found myself with Portuguese feeling like, oh, well, I can read it. I mean, when I was in Argentina, I went to Brazil and I spoke to folks in Spanish. They spoke to me in Portuguese and we were able to have a conversation and it was fine. Like, I could understand them. You miss little things here and there, but once you figure out how the accent is different, it's fairly easy to read and understand. So I was like, I could speak Portuguese. I could learn this. When I started, I'm like, oh, no sotaque horrible. I'm like that's horrible, right? And so it's been really fun exploring Portuguese. My goal now moving forward, I've integrated into my business, my own professional development. So my goal now moving forward is always to learn a new language each year. With French and Portuguese and kind of fine-tuning those. French, I actually had an opportunity to learn when I was a kid, and I specifically chose Spanish because I was at a very New England private school, and one of the young women, who we will say did not look like me, she was one of my palest sisters, and she was like, well, why do you want to learn Spanish? What do you want to do? Be a maid when you grow up?
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And she said that to me, and I'm like, I don't want to learn French because that's where all the, like, in my mind, just ignorantly as a child, similar to how you said when you're young, I was in 7th or 8th grade, I thought to myself, that's the racist white people language. I don't want to learn French, right? Which is really ignorant to think of because there are all of these people, Black folks who speak French, and there's so many different people across the world who speak French, but that was my introduction to French. And so for that reason, I said it felt like, oh no, and then the irony of being an English speaker and worrying about like what's European and what's not. I'm like, I'm already speaking a European language, but
right. Exactly.
I mean, it's just like, okay, so retroactively, I realized how ignorant it was for me to base my feelings and emotions about an entire language on what one 7th grade little girl said to me. But it really cut me off for French for a large percentage of as a child. I never was interested in French. And it wasn't until I went to college, really, that I started to get more curious about French and more interested in French in addition to Spanish. I just never pursued it in the same way as I pursued Spanish.
So what did that look like for you? Like when you first started learning Spanish, because you mentioned studying abroad in Argentina, what did that look like for you? Did you follow more of an immersion approach, or what do you think was the thing that got you from just being someone who like casually learned Spanish? Like I'm sure some of our listeners are dibbling and dabbling and trying to figure out, can they really speak this language fluently? What got you from sort of like your initial interest to the point where you feel like, okay, this is a language I'm confident I can speak and I can use professionally?
I think, honestly, it's probably the exact opposite of what pushed me away from French is what pushed me towards becoming an interpreter and getting a certification as a simultaneous interpreter. It was because I did get a lot of exposure to people who looked like me, people who thought like me, whether they looked like me or not, but people who cared about social justice, people who cared about creating change in the world. I got a lot of exposure to people who spoke multiple languages and were doing really dope things in the world. And it made me want to be a part of that. And I felt, I think being at Howard, particularly with the professors that I had, I didn't feel like it wasn't an option for me. I think if I had have been in a different environment, I might have thought the interpreting profession or something like that, wasn't for me. But it felt very comfortable. I mean, and when I say comfortable, I mean, it felt comfortable in the community sense. It was still challenging. Like it's not, an easy profession to navigate and things to do. There's it definitely requires networking and connecting when you're interested in entering into the language field. But it really was just because I had people around me that I wanted to connect with. And I think that's my big thing for language learners. And it's the reason why a lot of my work is not just about language justice, but it's also about multilingual community building. Because I don't know for your listeners if they're familiar with language justice, but language justice, a lot of people are talking about it more so now. And they talk about it more from the perspective of, having interpreters, having translators, creating multilingual spaces where people can choose whatever language they want to speak. But rarely do you hear people in the language justice sphere talking about language learning, right? And my feeling was like, there's all of these really cool people doing these amazing things. I want to be able to talk to them. You know what I mean? I want to be able to have a conversation with them. And what if they don't speak English? It just doesn't make sense that that's the only reason I can't talk to them. And I don't want to have to be filtered through an interpreter or a translator all the time. And so that is, for me, is what made me interested in learning more languages. But the interpreting and translation side, that part felt important because I realized how important it was to have certain voices represented as interpreters. If you think about it, interpreters are helping people negotiate, treaties,